All right, back to our top story this hour, the escalating battle between Montana's first openly transgender female lawmaker and a Republican-controlled legislature.
Republicans yesterday voting to ban Representative Zooey Zephyr from the House chamber for the rest of the session after she spoke out against a ban on gender-affirming care for young people. Well, State Rep Zooey Zephyr joining us live now. I'm sure you've had a very busy few days and a busy morning. Everyone anxious to talk to you to kind of get your take on what has happened there. I'm wondering if you see any parallels between what you're experiencing right now and what we saw unfold in Tennessee with the lawmakers there and the issue of gun control. Obviously a very different issue in Montana, but do you see any parallel between how you're being treated and how they were treated? And what do you think it means for the country?
I do. I see, first and foremost, a mismatch between the policies that these legislatures, particularly those controlled by the far right, are trying to pass and how out of step that is with what Americans actually want. Trans people in our communities are often loved and accepted, and we're seeing policies targeting us at an unprecedented level. In Tennessee, when young Black lawmakers are talking about the impact that gun violence has, most Americans want common sense gun reform, but these legislatures are not allowing it. So we're seeing young legislators rise up and say, no, this isn't acceptable, and calling out the real harm that these policies do. And in response, those legislatures are trying to shut down that discussion.
And the policy that you were speaking out about was for lawmakers who wanted to ban gender-affirming care. You said that they would have blood on their hands if they did so. You were accused of being hyperbolic and perhaps inciting a quote-unquote riot with those words, but you are being literal. Tell us a little bit more about what you meant when you said that and what your message is in regard to the initial issue that brought you to speak out.
And they are, when it comes to gender-affirming care, the bans placed, it's important to note that they're banning health care that is approved by every major medical association in our country. And there's statistics that we can talk about. There's a 73% reduction in suicidality for trans youth who have access to gender-affirming care. But I also see the firsthand experiences. I've lost friends to suicide. I've had friends who've been assaulted, Montanans reaching out about being assaulted on the streets because of policies like this. And we even heard from a family whose trans teenager attempted suicide while listening to one of these anti-trans hearings. So I see the way these bills bring real harm. And when I spoke, what I was doing is holding the legislature accountable for the policies that they were bringing forward.
Big picture here for a second, just reading some recent reporting. Across the country, transgender rights have emerged this year as a defining legislative issue, with Republicans enacting sweeping new restrictions in states they control. Legislatures in dozens of states have introduced more than 400 bills targeting trans people since January. At least 29 have become law, more than the total number of such bills passed in all of 2022 in the U.S. Why do you think this is such a lightning rod issue in our country, and why do you think we're seeing such swift legislative action and tough response to it?
So I think they are looking, the Republican-controlled legislatures are looking for a community that they can other to drum up support for whatever their voter base. But I think they're missing the mark because, again, trans people are loved and accepted in our communities. And as we're seeing, when you talk about the increase in legislation, it's important to note that a couple years ago we weren't seeing that. But when they got their foot in the door with bans on trans athletes, that was never their goal. Their goal was to continue to escalate. And that's why we're seeing youth healthcare bans. Missouri, which had its adult healthcare ban that thankfully now has a temporary stay by the courts. Florida passing legislation to allow people to remove children if their parent is trans, or remove a trans child from their parents. We're seeing an increasing escalation, and it's a legislative eradication.
And I have a sort of two-part question for you. Republicans in the Montana Freedom Caucus appear to be continually and purposefully misgendering you. I want to know what goes through your mind when that happens, especially given that this word decorum has been thrown around a lot in all of these debates, including the one in Tennessee. It's the use of the word decorum. Decorum could be translated or synonymous with the word decency in some ways. Do you believe that you are being treated indecently by these representatives? And in turn, do you think you could have done something differently to avoid it being barred from the floor, or was this the only path you saw forward?
So it's hypocritical of them to call for decorum at the same time they repeatedly and intentionally misgender me. But this is also coming from a caucus that advocates, in theory, limited government, using government to take away healthcare from people who need it. And that's what we've seen this legislative session is an unequal and undemocratic application of the fuzzy concept of decorum. When the speaker is in agreement, there's a lot of leeway given. We've heard people claim that my very existence is somehow sexualizing children. And we objected, but we moved on, and that was allowed to go forward. As for would I change anything, when I rose up again, I was talking about real harm that these bills bring, and to apologize or to not have said that would be to be complicit in the policies that get my community killed. And that's not what my constituents sent me here to do. They sent me here to speak truth.
And on the issue of decorum, I don't remember these same Republicans having such a strong reaction when the media was being called the enemy of the American people, or an armed mob being told, fight like hell, or you're not going to have a country left anymore. Or if you indict me, there could be death and destruction in the country. As long as we're having a discussion on decorum, let's not forget a larger context and other comments that have been made and what they've led to. Let me get down, though, to this question, because at the heart of the issue in Tennessee was gun control. At the heart of this issue is this gender-affirming care, and that includes hormones, or cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, surgery, those who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. On the issue again, beyond your own political situation, help folks who don't understand or don't agree with the idea that perhaps those kinds of treatments seem severe or intense for folks of a young age. The argument being that aren't kids too young to undergo those kind of procedures when they haven't had a chance to fully grow, perhaps, and realize who they are and what they want to be. I'm just playing devil's advocate for a second and talk about the actual issue that's on the table. Talk about gender-affirming care and why you think it's appropriate for while people are young and still growing and developing and discovering themselves.
So it's important to understand underpinning all of this is trans people, when we are allowed to transition, come into ourselves, live lives full of joy in a way that would not have been possible prior to our transition. I couldn't do the work I do for the people of Montana had I not transitioned and been able to stand tall in who I am. When it comes to gender-affirming care for youth, it's important to note that these decisions are being made in conjunction with parents, with endocrinologists, with their healthcare providers, in accordance with every major medical association's guidelines. At a young age, transitioning is really just social transitioning. It's going by a new name. It's letting someone grow their hair out or cut it short. That's where it starts. As puberty comes along, if people's gender dysphoria has been consistent, insistent, and persistent, then they say, hey, let's try puberty blockers. Let's put a pause on that to see if the child still wants to move forward. These are slow processes, again, with medical professionals there every step of the way. And if they continue to go on and say, yes, I'm trans, then they're allowed to go on hormone replacement therapy. And most surgeries wait until 18 unless there's severe dysphoria, in which case you see something like a mastectomy, which again is something that can already happen with cisgender teenagers for various issues.
So what comes next for you at the very least, and also regarding these bills that have been introduced? You are still allowed to cast votes during House proceedings for the remainder of the session, but that ends next week, May 5th. So what comes next for you? What kind of work do you plan to do moving forward, especially now that this national spotlight has been brought to Montana?
So I was elected by my constituents to represent their interests in the People's House. I left yesterday with my head held high, and I will walk in this morning with my head held high, ready to do the work. That said, it's important to note in this last week, as we see major housing bills, as we see the state's budget come forward, there are still 11,000 Montanans whose voices are not represented in that debate. My heart is set on doing what I can to make sure those voices are heard.
All right, Montana State Representative Zooey Zephyr, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate you taking the time out to come and speak with us. Have a good rest of your day.
Right back.